Daniel Reed offered the bank $10,000 for a narrow strip of land everyone agreed was worthless. The loan officer laughed, slid the paperwork back across the desk, and told him nobody wanted that piece of dirt. Months later, the bank announced a $50 million commercial development that would transform the entire county. Then everything stopped when the only legal route for the entrance road, drainage system, and utility lines crossed one forgotten strip. It was the same strip Daniel now controlled, and the bank that had refused his offer suddenly needed it more than anyone else. But this time, Daniel was not making an offer. He was waiting for the bank to knock on his door. Daniel Reed had spent most of his life working land that belonged to other people. At 46, he wasn't a wealthy investor or a real estate developer. He was a fence builder, a part-time ranch hand, and occasionally a heavy equipment operator whenever someone in Mason County needed an extra pair of hands. The work was honest. The pay was enough to keep the lights on, most months. His pickup had over 300,000 miles. His farmhouse needed a new roof. His savings account held just over $12,000, the result of nearly 15 years of putting aside every spare dollar he could. To most people, it wasn't enough money to change a life. To Daniel, it was everything. That Monday morning, he wasn't searching for an investment. He was delivering fence posts to a neighboring ranch when he noticed something odd beside the old state highway. A narrow strip of land sat between the pavement and an overgrown field. It wasn't large, maybe 30 feet wide, a few hundred yards long. The grass had disappeared beneath thorn bushes. Broken concrete pipes poked through the weeds. Half-buried railroad ties lay scattered across the ground, leftovers from a rail spur abandoned decades earlier. No mailbox. No buildings. No driveway. Nothing about it suggested value. Most drivers passed without ever realizing it was a separate parcel. Daniel probably would have done the same. But one rusted survey marker caught his eye. He stopped the truck, walked through the weeds, found another marker farther down. The strip had clearly defined boundaries. Someone owned it, or had owned it. That evening, curiosity took him to the county assessor's office. The clerk typed the parcel number into an aging computer. Haven't seen anyone ask about this one in years. She frowned at the screen. Looks like it belonged to Prairie Horizon Holdings. I've never heard of them. They dissolved a long time ago. So who owns it now? She clicked through several records. It's complicated. The company had defaulted on multiple loans nearly a decade earlier. Most of its assets had eventually been transferred to a regional bank after foreclosure proceedings. This forgotten strip appeared among those records. Daniel looked back at the aerial map. Something about the parcel bothered him. Not because of what it was, because of where it was. To the west lay hundreds of acres of vacant land that had quietly changed ownership over the past 2 years. The clerk noticed him staring. People say the bank's putting together something big out there. What kind of something? She shrugged. Nobody knows yet. Daniel thanked her and left. That night he spread county maps across his kitchen table. He traced highways, property lines, drainage ditches, rail easements. The narrow strip seemed insignificant. Yet every direct path from the highway toward the newly assembled properties crossed it. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe there was another entrance planned. Maybe he was imagining connections that didn't exist. Still, the next morning, Daniel walked into the regional bank carrying a simple written offer. $10,000. He wasn't trying to make a fortune. He simply wanted to buy a forgotten piece of land everyone else had ignored. He handed the offer across the desk. The loan officer glanced at the amount. Then at the parcel number. A slow smile appeared on his face. Before Daniel heard a single answer, the officer started laughing. The bank officer laughed long enough to draw the attention of 2 tellers. "You want to buy that strip?" he asked, still smiling. Daniel nodded. "That's right." The officer pushed the paper back across the desk. "You'd be throwing your money away. So, it's not for sale?" "I didn't say that." "Then, what's the problem?" "The problem," the officer replied, leaning back in his chair, "is that nobody here is wasting time selling a useless piece of land." Daniel waited. Silence often revealed more than another question. If it's useless, he finally asked, why keep it? The officer's smile faded for just a moment. It's part of old foreclosure paperwork. So you don't need it? We're not discussing our property portfolio. The conversation was over. Daniel thanked him, folded the offer, and walked back outside. He wasn't disappointed by the rejection. What stayed with him was the contradiction. The bank had no interest in selling land they insisted had no value. That afternoon, Daniel drove to the county planning department. The office occupied an aging brick building beside the courthouse. Inside, public maps and zoning notices covered the walls. A planner named Lisa greeted him. Can I help you? I'm trying to understand what's happening west of Highway 8. She smiled. A lot of people have been asking that lately. Without discussing any confidential information, Lisa pointed him towards several public files available for inspection. Most of them involved routine zoning requests, traffic studies, environmental reviews, infrastructure planning. Nothing unusual by itself. Daniel spent the afternoon reading. He noticed that several neighboring parcels had recently changed ownership. Some belonged to private investors. Others had passed through foreclosure before ending up under the same regional bank. He couldn't tell whether the transactions were connected. Near closing time, Lisa walked over. Find anything interesting? I'm not sure. He pointed toward a large county map. Are they building something out there? Maybe. She shrugged. There have been discussions about future commercial development, but nothing has been formally approved. No construction permits? Not yet. No final site plan? Not that I've seen. That answer only deepened Daniel's curiosity. If no project had officially moved forward, why was the bank so unwilling to let go of a forgotten strip of land? Before leaving, he purchased copies of the public parcel maps and ownership records. That evening, his kitchen table disappeared beneath aerial photographs and county plats. He wasn't trying to predict the future. He simply compared boundaries, roads, property lines. One detail slowly began to stand out. The narrow strip sat between Highway 8 and a large cluster of recently assembled land. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe another entrance already existed somewhere beyond the maps. Daniel wasn't ready to guess. But he knew enough to ask one more question. And the next time he visited the bank, he intended to ask it. Daniel waited 3 days before returning to the bank. Not because he expected a different answer, because he wanted better questions. This time, he carried more than a handwritten offer. Inside a plain folder were county ownership records, parcel maps, tax history, and a copy of the preliminary site plan he had obtained from the planning office. He approached the same desk. The same loan officer looked up. You again? Daniel smiled politely. I'd like to submit another offer. The officer glanced at the folder. You really haven't given up. I've increased it. How much? $12,000. The officer didn't even open the paperwork. I thought we already settled this. I'm only asking for an answer. You already have one. Daniel slid the documents across the desk anyway. I also have a few questions. The officer sighed. What now? Does the bank own this parcel outright? It belongs to the bank. According to which deed? The officer frowned. It came through foreclosure. I understand. Daniel pointed to the county ownership history. But foreclosure doesn't always transfer every interest immediately. The officer stopped smiling. For the first time, he actually looked at the papers. He flipped through 2 pages before pushing them aside. Legal handles all that. So you aren't certain? I'm certain enough. Daniel nodded. Would you mind confirming whether the title has been fully completed? I'm not calling legal over a useless strip of weeds. The answer sounded confident. The pause before it did not. Daniel thanked him and stood. You really believe there's something special about that land? The officer asked. I don't know. Then why keep coming back? Daniel looked toward the window. Cars rolled along Highway 8 only a few hundred yards away. Because people usually don't refuse easy money unless they think they're protecting something. The officer laughed again. This isn't some hidden treasure. I never said it was. Daniel walked out carrying the same folder. The offer remained unsigned. But something had changed. The officer had stopped treating the conversation like a joke. That afternoon, Daniel drove straight to the county recorder's office. He requested every publicly available document connected to Prairie Horizon Holdings. The clerk disappeared into the records room. When she returned, she placed several aging files on the counter. Most people never ask for these. Daniel spent hours reading mortgages, foreclosure filings, tax notices, and legal descriptions. Eventually, one document caught his attention. The foreclosure had transferred most of the company's property to the bank. Most. Not all. The forgotten strip appeared under a separate legal description tied to unpaid property taxes that had never been completely resolved. The bank had a financial interest, but the ownership trail wasn't nearly as simple as everyone assumed. Daniel copied every page. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to fall behind the hills. He sat inside his pickup reading the documents one more time. If he understood them correctly, the bank might not actually control the parcel yet. And if that was true, someone else still had a chance to acquire it legally. Daniel didn't return to the bank. Another conversation with the loan officer wouldn't answer the question that now mattered most. If the ownership records were incomplete, the answer would be found at the county offices, not inside a bank branch. The following Monday, he visited the county treasurer's office and requested every public record connected to the parcel. The clerk recognized him immediately. Still researching that little strip? Daniel smiled. I'm trying to understand why the paperwork never seems to end. She returned carrying a thick file. You're not the first person who's been confused. Inside were tax records, foreclosure notices, title documents, and correspondence dating back more than a decade. As Daniel worked through them, a clearer picture emerged. Prairie Horizon Holdings had stopped paying property taxes shortly before the company collapsed. The bank later foreclosed on most of the company's assets. But this particular parcel presented an unusual problem. Its legal description overlapped with an older railroad easement recorded decades earlier. During the foreclosure process, attorneys handling the larger portfolio transferred the bank's financial interest, but the title for this small strip remained tied to an unresolved tax proceeding already underway. Legally, the bank expected the issue to be resolved later. Practically, no one wanted to spend thousands of dollars in legal fees correcting a parcel everyone believed had little value. Year after year, the paperwork remained unfinished. Not because anyone forgot, because solving it had never seemed worth the expense. Daniel read the final page twice. Then he asked the clerk a simple question. What happens if the tax proceeding reaches its deadline before anyone clears the title? She pointed toward a notice posted beside her desk. The county may offer the tax certificate at public auction. When? She checked the calendar. 3 weeks from now. Do many people attend? She smiled. Mostly investors chasing larger properties. And this one? I'd be surprised if anyone noticed it. 3 weeks later, Daniel walked into the county meeting room carrying a cashier's check. The room was filled with investors interested in shopping centers, apartment buildings, and commercial lots with obvious value. When the forgotten strip appeared on the agenda, almost nobody looked up. The opening amount reflected unpaid taxes, penalties, and administrative costs. Daniel raised his bidder card. A man across the room skimmed the legal description, shrugged, and turned the page. No one else bid. The gavel struck. Sold. The total came to just under $10,000. Daniel completed the paperwork quietly. The tax certificate did not make him the owner immediately. State law still allowed time for redemption and additional legal procedures before title could be transferred. But if no qualified party completed that process before the deadline, Daniel would be entitled to apply for the deed. As he stepped outside the courthouse, his phone rang. The caller identification showed the regional bank. It was the first time anyone there had ever called him. He looked at the screen for a moment before answering. Mr. Reed, speaking. We'd like to discuss that parcel. 3 weeks earlier, the bank hadn't been interested in discussing it at all. Now suddenly, they couldn't wait. Daniel didn't return the bank's call until the next morning. Not because he wanted to play games. He simply wanted every conversation to happen after the auction paperwork had been officially recorded. When he finally answered, the same loan officer sounded noticeably different. Mr. Reed, we'd like to discuss the parcel. Daniel leaned back in his kitchen chair. I thought nobody wanted it. There was a brief silence. We've learned there may have been some confusion regarding its status. I see. Would you be available to meet this afternoon? Daniel agreed. At exactly 2 o'clock, he walked into the same branch where, only weeks earlier, his offer had been laughed away. This time, no one smiled. Instead of the public service desk, he was escorted into a conference room. Waiting inside were the loan officer, the branch manager, and a woman who introduced herself as the bank's legal counsel. The atmosphere felt completely different, professional, careful. The manager spoke first. We understand you recently purchased a tax certificate connected to one of our former foreclosure properties. I did. We'd like to resolve the matter quickly. Daniel nodded but said nothing. The attorney opened a folder. The bank is prepared to reimburse your expenses, including all filing costs, plus an additional $5,000. Daniel did the math in his head. The offer would leave him with a respectable profit, more money than he usually earned in several months. 3 weeks earlier, he probably would have accepted without hesitation. But something no longer made sense. If settling this paperwork was worth paying thousands of dollars immediately, why had the bank ignored it for over a decade? He looked at the attorney. Can I ask one question? Of course. Why is everyone suddenly in such a hurry? The room became quiet. The branch manager answered carefully. We're simply cleaning up old records. Daniel smiled politely. I don't think that's the whole reason. No one disagreed. Instead, the attorney slid a purchase agreement across the table. This offer is only intended to simplify ownership. Daniel didn't reach for the papers. Instead, he pulled a folded county map from his jacket. I've been studying this area. The manager glanced at the map but said nothing. Daniel continued. I noticed your bank now controls nearly every parcel behind this strip. Again, silence. So, I'll ask differently. He tapped the narrow piece of land with his finger. What exactly sits on the other side that makes this little strip worth buying today? The attorney closed the purchase agreement without answering. We're not prepared to discuss future development. Daniel finally had the answer he needed. Not from what they said, but from what they refused to say. He stood, gathered his map, and thanked everyone for their time. So you're declining the offer? The manager asked. For now. As Daniel reached the parking lot, he looked once more toward the overgrown strip beside Highway 8. Nothing about it had changed. The weeds were still waist-high. The broken concrete pipe still stuck out of the ground. It looked just as worthless as the day he first noticed it. Yet inside the bank, 3 professionals had spent an hour trying to buy it back. Daniel climbed into his pickup. Whatever was coming, it hadn't started yet. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing happened. No phone calls. No letters. No new offers. Life returned to normal. Daniel repaired fences for a neighboring ranch during the day and spent his evenings clearing brush from the narrow strip of land. The work was slow. Years of neglect had left the property buried beneath thorn bushes, dead saplings, rusted wire, and discarded concrete. Most people driving past assumed he was cleaning up a place that would never be worth the effort. One afternoon, an older rancher slowed his truck beside the highway. You the fellow that bought this mess? Daniel nodded. The man laughed. I've driven by this place for 30 years. Never seen anyone stop. There's a reason. Daniel smiled. I guess I'm trying to find it. The rancher wished him luck and drove away. Daniel kept working. He wasn't trying to improve the land. He wanted to understand it. He located every survey marker, measured every boundary, compared each corner against the county plat he carried folded inside his truck. Everything matched. The parcel was exactly where the records said it should be. Late Friday morning, another pickup stopped along the shoulder. This one carried a surveying company logo. 3 workers climbed out carrying tripods, global positioning receivers, and bright orange flags. Daniel watched from the far end of his property. One surveyor walked directly toward him. Morning, morning. We're surveying neighboring parcels. Daniel nodded. No problem. The surveyor unfolded a map. We'll probably need to cross here for a few measurements. Daniel looked at the drawing. One thin blue line passed straight through his parcel. I'm afraid you can't. The surveyor looked surprised. You own this? I do. We were told this corridor was available. Daniel handed him a copy of the recorded parcel map. The surveyors studied it for several seconds before calling the crew leader over. The two men compared documents. Neither looked happy. After a quiet conversation, they packed away their equipment without placing a single stake. Before leaving, the crew leader walked back to Daniel. "You may be hearing from the developers." "Developers?" He shrugged. "I'm not really supposed to discuss the project." He climbed into the truck. Within minutes, the vehicles disappeared down the highway. Daniel stood alone beside the overgrown strip. He hadn't argued. He hadn't threatened anyone. He had simply shown them a recorded property map. Yet an entire survey crew had stopped working because of one forgotten parcel. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hills, Daniel unfolded his county maps once more across the kitchen table. Then he noticed something he had overlooked before. A revised planning document had quietly been added to the county website earlier that week. Unlike the preliminary concept, this version showed the proposed entrance road in far greater detail. Daniel traced it slowly with his finger. It no longer passed near his property. It crossed directly through it. For the first time, he knew exactly why the bank had called him back. Daniel slept very little that night. Not because he was excited. Because he kept asking himself the same question. What if I'm reading the plans wrong? One drawing wasn't enough. Projects changed all the time. Roads were relocated. Engineering plans evolved. Entire developments were redesigned before construction ever began. The next morning, Daniel returned to the county planning office. Lisa recognized him immediately. "Back again. I need to verify something." She spread the newest transportation plans beside the earlier versions. "The entrance alignment changed," Daniel said. "It did. Why?" "The original design didn't meet the updated traffic requirements from the state." She pointed to several engineering notes. "So they shifted the entrance about 200 feet. Daniel followed the new alignment with his finger. Straight across his parcel. "What about another access road?" Lisa shook her head. The consultant studied several alternatives. She opened another file. One crossed protected wetlands. Another required a new railroad crossing. A third would force the developer to purchase additional private land and restart portions of the permitting process. "So none of them are simple." "Exactly." Daniel thanked her and left. 3 days later, survey crews returned. This time they stayed outside his property line. They measured, compared maps, made phone calls, then packed everything up again. A week passed. Construction accelerated across the rest of the development. Earth movers cleared building pads. Concrete crews prepared foundations. Utility contractors installed underground lines on completed sections. But the entrance corridor remained untouched. Daniel noticed something else. Every afternoon, small groups gathered near his property. Engineers, project managers, attorneys. Nobody argued. Nobody crossed the fence. They simply studied drawings before driving away again. Late the following week, a local equipment operator stopped beside Daniel's fence. "You own this strip?" "I do." The operator nodded toward the idle entrance corridor. "They've been trying every possible workaround." "What happened?" "The engineering team reviewed alternate access routes. They found one? They found three, and all three were rejected." "Why?" "Too expensive. Too much delay. Too many new approvals." He looked back toward the waiting equipment. "So headquarters made the call yesterday." "What call?" "They're suspending work on the entrance until the property issue is resolved." Daniel glanced across the site. For the first time, he noticed machines parked in neat rows instead of working. Crews remained busy elsewhere. But dozens of workers assigned to the entrance had nothing to do. The operator lowered his voice. "They've got nearly $50 million tied up in this project." He paused. "And every day that entrance sits unfinished costs somebody a lot of money." Daniel looked once more at the narrow strip of land everyone had once dismissed. It hadn't stopped the project overnight. Engineers had reviewed every alternative. Executives had weighed every option. Only after exhausting those possibilities had the company reached the same conclusion. To move forward, they would have to reach an agreement with him. Daniel's phone rang before sunrise. The caller identification showed the regional bank. This time, it wasn't the branch manager. It was someone from the bank's corporate office. Mr. Reed, speaking. My name is Karen Mitchell. I'm calling on behalf of our real estate division. Daniel stepped onto his front porch. What can I do for you? We'd like to meet regarding your property. I've already met with the bank. This will be different. They agreed to meet the following afternoon at the project office set up near the construction site. When Daniel arrived, the atmosphere felt nothing like his previous meetings. Large maps covered the walls. Engineers studied computer models. Construction schedules filled an entire whiteboard. Every date for the next 6 months had been carefully planned. Every date except one. The entrance corridor. Karen greeted him with a firm handshake. Thank you for coming. She led him into a conference room where 2 engineers and another attorney were already waiting. An aerial map filled the center of the table. Karen pointed directly at Daniel's narrow strip. As you know, your parcel sits here. Daniel nodded. We've recently completed our final engineering review. One engineer cleared his throat. The approved entrance road, underground utilities, water line, fiber conduit, and stormwater drainage all pass through this corridor. Daniel looked carefully at the drawing. So there isn't another entrance. There are alternatives, but the engineer hesitated. They're significantly more expensive. How much more? The room became quiet. Finally, Karen answered. Several $1,000,000. Daniel didn't react. Instead, he asked another question. If you build somewhere else, can the project continue? Yes, but not on schedule. The attorney slid a document across the table. We'd like to purchase your parcel. Daniel glanced at the first page. The offer was $150,000, nearly 15 times what he had paid. Only weeks earlier, that amount would have seemed unbelievable. Now, he looked past the number. The contract required him to transfer complete ownership immediately. It included broad construction rights, permanent utility easements, future expansion clauses, and language allowing additional access if the project grew. Daniel closed the folder. I'm not ready to sign. Karen remained calm. May I ask why? Because you're asking me to make a permanent decision. She nodded. That's fair. And I still don't know everything this land will be used for. One of the engineers leaned forward. Mr. Reed, every day this entrance remains unresolved costs the project money. Daniel looked around the room. For the first time, nobody laughed at his little strip of land. Nobody called it worthless. Nobody suggested he had wasted $10,000. Instead, an entire team of professionals sat waiting for his answer. Daniel stood. I'll consider your offer. As he reached the door, Karen spoke one last sentence. I hope you won't take too long. Daniel smiled politely. I don't think I'm the one who's running out of time. Daniel didn't call the bank for another week. He spent those days doing exactly what he had always done. Repairing fences, hauling hay, checking on neighbors who needed an extra hand. The unopened contract remained on his kitchen table. Every evening he read another page. Not the purchase price, the conditions. He highlighted every paragraph dealing with drainage, utility rights, future expansion, and permanent easements. By the end of the week, one thing became obvious. The bank wasn't simply buying 30 feet of land. They wanted permanent control over everything that could ever cross it. Roads, water, power, fiber optic cable, future utility upgrades, even temporary construction access beyond the current project. Daniel folded the contract and drove back to the site office. Karen was waiting. I was beginning to wonder if we'd hear from you. You said every day mattered. It does. She slid a fresh copy of the agreement across the table. We're prepared to increase our offer. Daniel didn't open it. I'd rather talk about something else. Karen looked surprised. I'm listening. I don't want to sell the land. The room became quiet. One of the attorneys exchanged a quick glance with the engineers. Karen finally asked, then why are you here? Because I think there's another solution. Daniel spread a county plat across the table. What you actually need isn't ownership. He pointed to the proposed entrance road. You need the legal right to cross my property. One engineer leaned forward. A permanent access easement. Daniel nodded. And utility easements where they're actually necessary. The attorney frowned. That leaves ownership with you, yes. Karen studied him for several seconds. You realize we'd normally insist on purchasing the parcel outright. I figured. So why should we agree? Daniel looked toward the construction site outside the window. Bulldozers sat idle near the unfinished entrance. Crews were working everywhere else, just not there. Because an easement gives you everything you need today. He paused. And it lets me protect what happens on my land tomorrow. Karen didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked the engineers to step outside. When the door closed, she spoke quietly. Our investors won't like this. They don't have to. They'll ask why we didn't buy the property. Daniel smiled. They can ask. For the first time since this whole process began, Karen smiled back. You negotiate differently than most people. I'm not negotiating. No. I'm trying to solve the problem without creating another one. Karen closed the folder. I can't approve this by myself. I know. She stood and extended her hand. But I think this conversation just became much more interesting. As Daniel walked toward his pickup, construction equipment remained silent beside the unfinished entrance. For the first time, however, the project wasn't waiting for him to sell. It was waiting for the bank to decide whether ownership was really worth delaying a $50 million development. The bank didn't respond for nearly 2 weeks. Construction continued across every completed section of the development. Concrete crews poured foundations. Steel frames rose above the cleared fields. Utility contractors worked from one building pad to the next. Only the entrance corridor remained untouched. Every day it sat unfinished, schedules slipped a little further behind. Then, late one Friday, a powerful storm swept across the county. Heavy rain fell through the night. Roadside ditches overflowed. Small creeks spilled onto nearby fields. By sunrise, much of the construction site was covered in standing water. Daniel drove out after the rain had eased. Engineers, inspectors, and contractors were already walking the site. Karen spotted him. I'm glad you came. She led him toward the unfinished entrance. Temporary drainage channels had overflowed. Fresh soil had washed downhill. Several pieces of equipment were stranded in deep mud. The lead engineer studied the flooded ground. We underestimated how quickly the runoff would concentrate here. Daniel looked across the landscape without saying anything. For the past several weeks, while clearing brush on his own property, he had noticed the same pattern after every rainfall. Water always collected in the same shallow depression before leaving the area. He had never thought much about it. It was simply how the land behaved. Karen noticed him watching. You've seen this before? Daniel nodded. Not flooding like this. But after every rain, the water always seems to leave through that low swale. He pointed toward a shallow natural channel crossing the edge of his property. I figured it had probably been doing that for years. The lead engineer walked over. He compared Daniel's observation with the topographic survey already clipped to his clipboard. For several minutes, he said nothing. Then another engineer joined him. They checked elevation points, measured slopes, compared drainage calculations. Finally, the lead engineer looked up. We ignored this natural drainage path because it looked too small on the original survey. He shook his head. The storm just proved it carries far more water than we estimated. Back inside the project office, the engineering team overlaid fresh field measurements onto their existing plans. Nobody asked Daniel to redesign the project. They didn't need him to. What they needed was the one piece of local knowledge they had never collected. The engineers adjusted the entrance alignment to follow the natural drainage corridor instead of cutting across it. The revised model reduced excavation, improved stormwater flow, and lowered future maintenance costs. Karen closed the final drawing and looked at Daniel. You didn't solve our engineering problem. Daniel smiled. I wouldn't know how. No. She smiled back. But you helped us notice the land before we tried to change it. For the first time since this entire dispute began, the discussion was no longer about buying Daniel's property. It was about building the project the right way. 3 days later, Daniel received another phone call from Karen. We've revised the proposal. I'll come by this afternoon. When Daniel arrived, the atmosphere inside the project office had changed again. There were no thick purchase contracts waiting on the table. No aggressive deadlines. No pressure. Instead, a single map lay open beside a new engineering drawing. Karen greeted him with a smile. I think we're finally talking about the same problem. Daniel sat down. What changed? The storm. She pointed toward the revised site plan. Our engineers redesigned the entrance corridor using the natural drainage path you identified. The lead engineer nodded. It reduces excavation, lowers construction costs, and significantly improves stormwater flow. Daniel studied the drawing. The entrance road still crossed his property, but only where it absolutely needed to. The unnecessary expansion areas had disappeared. So, Karen continued, here's our proposal. She slid a much thinner agreement across the table. Instead of purchasing the land, the bank requested 3 permanent easements. One for the entrance road, one for underground utilities, one for drainage maintenance. Nothing more. Daniel read every page carefully. The easements were clearly defined. Future expansion required his written approval. The bank would maintain the road permanently. Any construction damage to his remaining property had to be repaired at the bank's expense. Even better, a new clause required annual inspections of the drainage system to protect neighboring farmland from flooding. Daniel looked up. This wasn't in the first contract. Karen smiled. No, it should have been. She nodded. I agree. The financial terms had changed as well. The bank would pay him a substantial one-time compensation for the easements. They would also cover every surveying, legal, and recording expense. Daniel wasn't becoming a millionaire. He had never expected to. But the agreement respected both the value of his property and the importance of the project. He closed the folder. I have one last condition. Karen folded her hands. Go ahead. I want every neighboring landowner to receive a copy of the final drainage plan. The engineer looked surprised. Why? Because water doesn't stop at property lines. The room became quiet. After a moment, Karen smiled. That's reasonable. The attorney added the language before anyone left the room. An hour later, Daniel signed. Karen signed after him. Then the engineer shook his hand. So did you know this land would become valuable? Daniel laughed softly. No. What did you know? I knew something didn't make sense. He looked out the window toward the entrance corridor, where crews were already unloading equipment. When people refuse to sell something they insist is worthless, it's usually worth asking why. Outside, engines started. For the first time in weeks, bulldozers rolled toward the entrance. The $50 million project was finally moving again. Not because Daniel had given up his land, but because both sides had found a way to use it fairly. Construction officially resumed the following Monday. For the first time in nearly a month, trucks rolled through the entrance without stopping. Concrete mixers arrived before sunrise. Steel deliveries followed throughout the morning. By noon, the access road that had delayed an entire $50 million project was finally carrying equipment instead of arguments. Daniel stood beside the fence for a few minutes before heading back to work. There was no ribbon cutting. No newspaper waiting to interview him. That was fine with him. He had never wanted attention. A few weeks later, Karen stopped by his farmhouse carrying a framed photograph. It showed the completed entrance road stretching toward the new commercial development. You might want this, she said. Daniel smiled. I've already got the view. She laughed. I suppose you do. The project continued over the following year. Warehouses opened. Local businesses expanded. More than 200 people found steady jobs. The county collected new tax revenue that funded road repairs and improvements to nearby schools. The entrance road crossed Daniel's property exactly as the easement allowed. Nothing more. The drainage system performed through every major storm that followed. Fields surrounding the project remained protected, just as the revised engineering plans intended. One afternoon, the same loan officer who had laughed at Daniel's original offer stopped by the property. He climbed out of his truck looking slightly uncomfortable. I owe you an apology. Daniel leaned against the fence. You don't owe me anything. I laughed. You did. I thought you were wasting your savings. Daniel smiled. So did a lot of people. The officer looked toward the busy entrance road. I guess I never understood what you saw. Daniel shook his head. Neither did I. The officer looked confused. I didn't buy this land because I knew what would happen. You didn't? No. Daniel picked up a small stone from the roadside and turned it in his hand. I bought it because something didn't make sense. The bank said it was worthless, but they wouldn't let it go. He tossed the stone back into the grass. When someone's words don't match their actions, pay attention to the actions. The loan officer nodded slowly. For the first time, he understood. The lesson had never been about making a fortune from forgotten land. It wasn't about beating the bank. It wasn't even about the $50 million project. It was about asking better questions than everyone else. As the sun began to set, Daniel walked along the fence line one last time. The narrow strip still looked ordinary. 30 feet of ground, a road, a drainage ditch, utility lines buried beneath the soil. Nothing about it suggested it had once brought an entire development to a standstill. Some people spend their lives searching for valuable land. Daniel discovered something different. Sometimes the greatest value isn't found in what a piece of land can become. It's found in understanding why someone else quietly refuses to let it go. And that lesson was worth far more than the $10,000 he had risked in the beginning. If Daniel's story reminded you that the right question can reveal value everyone else overlooks, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever noticed that someone's actions told a different story from their words? If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss more stories about persistence, fairness, and unexpected opportunity. Thank you for watching, and remember, real wisdom is not always knowing what will happen next. Sometimes it is simply recognizing when something does not make sense and having the patience to discover why.